Coming off of a second straight Stanley Cup final loss, the Oilers knew change was coming. Now, after the first week of the offseason, we have an idea of what that looks like and a whole lot more on today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I just wrapped up my third NHL season as a host on the Locked On Podcast Network, and I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network where we've got your team covered every day. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, where right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So, on today's very busy edition of Locked On Oilers, we're going to start by talking about the Evander Kane trade. We'll pivot to the Trent Frederic extension in our second segment, and we will tie a bow on today's show with everyone's favorite topic, the Oilers goaltending situation, and why I might have been right, unfortunately, on Friday's show. So, to start things out, the NHL salary cap exists to penalize good teams. The entire idea of a salary cap is to prevent teams from hoarding all of the talent. And generally speaking, and we've seen this pretty consistently throughout the salary cap era, which comes from 2005 to the present, teams are going to try and find ways to keep guys if they feel like they're essential. If a team feels they need to keep a player because they're imperative to the direction of the team long term, they will find a way to shed salary somewhere else. So generally speaking, if a team doesn't have a great opinion of a player or thinks they would rather just have the cap space and to reset, if you will, that's when they're going to dump someone. And not all of these are equal, because sometimes you're going to get something in return. Sometimes you're not. And in the case of Evander Kane getting traded to the Vancouver Canucks, number one, very surprising that Vancouver, division opponent, would agree to take Evander Kane entirely in terms of his salary for the 1 year that remains. And with 1 year remaining, I can see a world from the Canucks perspective that if I were Patrick Alvin, that I could tell myself, Evander Kane can put up 20 to 25 goals at $5 million. That's a lot cheaper than what we're going to have to pay Brock Boeser, because Brock Boeser's an unrestricted free agent. He's a couple years younger. He's still got a little bit of room there as far as Boeser goes for production. Whereas with Kane, you're pretty defined. I think Evander Kane is a very unique hockey player in terms of his skill set. We don't see a lot of these offense only and frankly shoot first only wingers anymore. He has a little bit more than that. He's a pretty good forechecker. He does like to mix it up, and I know some teams value that more than others. But for the Oilers, they needed to create cap space. And we identified Evander Kane as a cap casualty pretty early on. Victor Arvidsson is somebody who comes to mind as well. I'm sure there are other guys, but with Evander Kane out of the mix, the Oilers have more cap space at their disposal. Of course, as we've discussed ad nauseum, that's basically covering for Leon's pay raise, because Leon's going from $8.5 million to $14 million, and that $5.5 million increase is basically the entirety of Evander Kane's money. Now, you also need to give Evan Bouchard a contract, and you need to account for whatever Connor McDavid's new number is going to be after next season. But as far as Evander Kane and just tying a bow on his Oilers tenure and why the trade works from a logistical standpoint, Evander Kane is a complicated person. And I don't like using cop-out words like complicated, because that takes away agency. He's done some things that have made him look bad. The gambling stuff, the betting on himself, the losing money, the allegations of betting on hockey, faking a vaccine card to get into the United States during the 2021 season. He's been accused of some pretty stupid things, some immature things. You know, he's had issues in Buffalo. He's had issues in other stops along the way in his NHL career. And this is someone who, for lack of a better word, has struggled to get out of his own way at times. And that's irregardless of the allegations from his ex-wife, and there's a lot to unpack there. And without knowing the full scope of everything, saying complicated doesn't feel sufficient, but at the same time, I don't know authoritatively enough. So speaking just in terms of the losing all his money, the vaccine stuff, those are the signs of an immature guy. And when the Sharks bought him out, Ken Holland and the Oilers were in a very desperate situation. They desperately needed complementary talent for Connor, for Leon, to not be wasting the primes of two of the best players in the entire NHL. When they signed Evander Kane to that 1-year deal for close to the league minimum, I want to say it was like $1 million, $1.25 million, he played okay. He was decent last year before he got hurt in the playoffs. He was good at the start of the playoffs this year, but as the playoffs went along, his effectiveness did wane. He took way too many penalties in the Stanley Cup final, and I think that's really a good encapsulation of his faults as a hockey player. I think when you watch Evander Kane in the defensive zone and even in the offensive zone as part of a cycle sequence, his offensive instincts as anything other than a shooter are not great. He's not a great passer. He doesn't find open lanes. He doesn't hit guys on the tape. He doesn't hit them in stride. He's a window thrower, to use some NFL parlance, where he's going to get the puck in your general area, but you're going to be the one who has to make the play. And it sucks having to salary dump 20 to 30 goal guys because you need a bunch of them throughout the course of your lineup to be a competitive hockey team. And cap space does eventually become more valuable because you need to keep your key pieces, as we talked about before. If the Oilers wanted to keep Evander Kane, they would have found a way to move some other salary, but being that he was probably the easiest player to move, being that he only had 1 year remaining on his deal, he's a little bit older, he's a little bit more worn down, a couple more miles on the treads, it makes sense the Oilers identified him as a trade candidate. And again, I'm still kind of in shock the Canucks agreed to do this purely because at least if the Oilers had retained, $2 million or $1.25 million, just something off the top to make it a little more enticing for the Canucks. But instead, the way the Canucks are talking about this, it sounds like they think Evander Kane's going to be an impact player for them. And look, I think Kane is a functional hockey player. I think if he's on your third line, you're a pretty good hockey team. I think if he's on your second line, it depends who he's playing with. But just in terms of the hockey, there's definitely some juice there. There's definitely some juice left in the fruit to squeeze out. And I don't think the Canucks are going to be an incredible hockey team next year. I expect them to be middle of the road, maybe a bubble playoff team. But Evander Kane, with the right pieces around him, still has some hockey left to give. And that's why, if you're an Oilers fan who's upset that Kane's gone, I understand. You need a 4 or 5 of these 20-goal guys sprinkled throughout your lineup. You think about how effective that Zach Hyman, Evander Kane, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins line was in the Vegas series and in the LA series. That was arguably the Oilers' best line at 5-on-5. They were absolutely humming along. The forechecking from the tandem of Kane and Hyman on the flanks was incredible. They were hitting everything that moved. They were getting into scrums after whistles. They were making the Kings in Vegas uncomfortable, and it has an effect. And look, the Oilers need more of that. Nobody's questioning the Oilers need more forechecking, the need for more cycle-first players. We all know they need a better supporting cast because that was part of what was their undoing this year in the Stanley Cup final. And look, it's a hard process here. You have to weigh your pros and cons. Now, we'll see how the Oilers choose to advance through this narrative, frankly, advance through free agency. Their name's been linked to Brock Besser, even though I don't really see a fit there in terms of either style or, frankly, cap space. I don't think the Oilers could afford what Brock was asking for unless he was willing to take less to become an Oiler, and I don't see why he would do that. And I don't think his skating is where it would need to be to play with Connor or, frankly, to play with Leon. Brock's one of my favorite players. I own his jersey. I just don't think he's really a style fit for what the Oilers do. So we're going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. And coming up next, I'm going to tell you why I don't necessarily agree with Stan Bowman's evaluation of Trent Frederic. Coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, high-stakes soccer, or the WNBA, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. FanDuel makes it so easy to stay in the game. before the action begins or after the game starts. You can use FanDuel to keep track of daily promotions and all types of fun ways to bet. It's easy to use, fast to pay out, and makes even regular season games exciting. Whether I'm placing a same-game parlay or watching a bet ride into the ninth inning, FanDuel makes me feel like I'm part of the action. And there's never been a better time to sign up with FanDuel, because now new customers can bet just $5 and they're going to get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open FanDuel today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers. And I'm just going to be frank and I'm going to be very candid. One of my overarching guiding principles in hockey roster construction is you do not give term to bottom six forwards. Just on principle, you don't do it. You don't do it. The minutes they don't play a lot. 12, 13, maybe 14 minutes. They're not going to get on your first power play. Maybe your first penalty kill, depending on the skill set. Generally, they're going to have more miles on the tires because of the type of game that's required to be a consistent bottom sixer. And then the obvious point, it's really hard for them to put up counting stats. And generally speaking, the snapshot evaluation of whether or not a player is worth their contract is the counting stats. What is Trent Frederic going to put up in an average season over the next 8 years? And is he going to be worth that $3.8 million? And I really do struggle to think about where the Oilers go in terms of flexibility. And that's the thing. And at $3.5 million and the cap going up, it's not crazy. This isn't a ridiculous number. The term is what gives me pause, and we don't know on the clauses, no trade, no move, etc. So it's a little hard to judge how movable Trent Frederic will be going forward. But by and large, getting invested in these bottom six guys only leads you to frustration. And I think Trent Frederic is a decent hockey player. I think there's more to get out of him going forward in his career. He's been very inconsistently used throughout his NHL career, both in Boston as an Oiler. And look, I understand he was really injured at the point of acquisition when the Oilers acquired him at the trade deadline. But I never felt that he particularly fits what the Oilers are trying to do. And look, if he's your one-to-one Evander Kane replacement, you're going to be disappointed because an average Trent Frederic season is 13 goals. Evander Kane's been a 25-goal guy pretty much his entire NHL career, and that's a real drop-off. 12 goals is a whole nother roster player of difference between these two. And Trent Frederic at $3.5 million or Evander Kane at $5.1, is $1.6 million worth another 12 to 15 goals? I think so. And maybe the Oilers prioritize the fact that Frederic 5-6 years younger than Evander Kane, somebody who they feel has a little bit more of an upward trajectory. Maybe there's even a higher ceiling to reach. And I'm very skeptical someone of Frederic's profile is just going to get better at 28, 29 years old, even playing with Connor McDavid or Leon Draisaitl, which I don't think very similarly to what I had just said about Brock Besser at the end of the first segment, style-wise, I don't think Trent Frederic fits as an Oilers top sixer. And I think you don't give 8-year contracts worth $3.5 million to third or fourth liners. I think that's really bad practice. And we all know Stan Bowman's management of the salary cap in Chicago was part of why that roster fell apart as quick as it did, and why ultimately they're in the midst of the fourth year of their rebuild. And God knows when the next time the Blackhawks are going to be seriously competitive. And I understand why. I understand why Stan Bowman did this. From a business standpoint, from just a purely roster management standpoint, they needed an Evander Kane replacement. Trent Frederic is an Evander Kane facsimile. He can forecheck well, he can hit, he can fight. He has the snarl, the after the whistle stuff that the old heads love. I get it. But at the same time, Trent Frederic is almost certainly not going to give you $3.5 million of value going forward. And I understand that the cap's going to be $95.5 million and then 104, then 110. I understand that with time, this contract is going to become significantly lower percentage of the salary cap, especially because it's on the lower end of the scale. I just don't see why They needed to go long. And sidebar, do the Oilers know Trent Frederick's going to be 100% healthy? Or is this going to be just the rest of his career? He's not that fast because his ankle is dinged up. Because if he's going to skate the way he did in the playoffs for 8 more years, he's going to be really ineffective. As we go forward, the NHL is only going to get smaller and faster with time because those guys are going to get more and more specialized skill sets. And those are guys who are inefficiencies. The faster and smaller you are, the better a puck handler you are, the more utility you have up and down a lineup. You're slower, you're more lumbering, you have fewer options to stick, you have fewer roles you can play, especially on a good team. If Trent Frederick's on your third line, you're probably a pretty good team. When the Bruins went crazy a couple years ago and they won the President's Trophy, Frederick was on the periphery of that team. He didn't play a crazy amount of minutes on that Bruins team. I want to say he was probably in the ballpark or 12, 13 minutes, something like that. And I'm going to pull it up right now while I'm talking about it. But there was I didn't see the vision there for what they were trying to do. I did not see the vision, what the Oilers are trying to do. Trent Frederick checked in, oh my goodness, 11.55 per game, 79 regular season games, 31 points on that Bruins team that won the President's Trophy that had 131 standings points. Somebody who was pretty low in that lineup, somebody who didn't play a lot of minutes. You go up and down this graphic. So Pasternak more minutes, Marchand more minutes, Bergeron, Krejci, Coyle, DeBrusk, Tyler Bertuzzi, Pavel Zacha, Taylor Hall, Thomas Nosek, Nick Foligno, then Trent Frederick. We're talking about a 9th, 10th, 11th forward on a really good team. Okay, especially considering he was on an entry-level contract at the time. That's great. 31 points for $925,000. That's a great deal. Somebody you projected would have upside, somebody you thought would improve with time, and it just hasn't manifested. The puck skills for Trent Frederick just aren't where they need to be for him to be a top 6 player in the NHL. And at this point, at his age, I reason to stand that he's not going to get significantly better just by getting more opportunity, more ice time, who he plays with. His career average in goals for a season is 13. This is somebody who has some really heavy miles in terms of the way he plays on his body. So even though he's only 27, 28 years old, he's probably got a little bit more aches and pains than your average 27, 28-year-old in the NHL, especially one that was a former first-round pick, which is the other part of this, that Frederick was drafted relatively high, 29th overall in 2016. Doesn't have a lot to show for his NHL career. 109 points in 338 games. He's turning 27 years old midway through next season. I really don't see why the Oilers felt the need to go this long. And if it's because Stan Bowman said, well, I'd like to give him a 1-year deal and a prove-it deal effectively, and he wanted like $5-6 million per year, okay. But at the same time, I think you could get a better player for $3.5 million than Trent Frederick. I don't think Trent Frederick is anything remarkable. He's a solid NHLer. He's not bad at hockey. I just don't think there's enough upside there and enough of a runway to get to a higher level. Even though he's still on the younger side at 26, turning 27, I don't see a world where he's going to go to that 25, 30 goal threshold, even if he sneaks on with a Connor or a Leon occasionally next year. But we're going to take our second and final break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. So when we come back, unfortunately, I was right on Friday's edition of Locked On Oilers. Coming up next. Thank you to everyone who's hanging out on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers. Thank everyone that's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. If you're starting the day, you're on the way to work, on the way to school, in the gym, on a run, whatever. I know I usually will do a podcast on a run to try and make it feel like I'm not wanting to jump off a bridge, but that's a different conversation for a different day. But to wrap up today's show, coming out of that Stanley Cup final, the loudest question was, how do the Oilers improve their goaltending room? And again, for the umpteenth time, I don't think Calvin Pickard or Stuart Skinner are the reason the Oilers lost the Stanley Cup final this year or last year. That said, that is the most glaring deficiency on this roster. Yes, they need a lot of help up front. You lose Evander Kane. You look like you're going to lose Corey Perry. You're probably going to trade Victor Arvidsson. You're not bringing Jeff Skinner back. Even if you want to pencil Matthew Savoie in for one of those spots, you still need 2 or 3 top 6 forwards to add on to this group. Yeah, Hyman will be back. Nuge will be back. You have 4 guys for 6 spots. You need 2 more top 6 wingers. And then maybe you're not going to bring Connor Brown back. Okay, you need a third line winger. How are you supposed to make all of the money work there up front? Address what you probably need to do in net. And look, John Gibson was a tall ask. And I said it as much on Friday. At $6 million per year, I struggle to see a world where the Oilers could afford to take on that salary. And the package Detroit paid, the Oilers absolutely could have given up comparable assets, but they didn't have the money to make it work. And Stan Bowman has been very explicit in saying he didn't feel like the options that were available were that significant of an upgrade to justify the cost. Now, I disagree with that, and I don't think John Gibson is anything special at this point in his career. He struggles to stay healthy, only 28, 29 starts last year. Nice save percentage, 912. But I don't see Gibson being a massive improvement. And that's what I think Stan Bowman's holding out for. He's holding out hope he can find his starting goalie for an extended run. And there's a part of him that's pretty convinced he might be able to manufacture Stuart Skinner into a passable one. And while that might sound insane, and I am inclined to say it's a little bit crazy, it seems like what the Oilers' plan is. They think that the team in front of him is going to be good enough that they can justify not going out and spending on a goalie. And there are going to be guys out there that are at least interesting on Tuesday. You know, Jake Allen and Skinner would be interesting. Alex Lyon, probably not as steady an option as Jake Allen. And then the trade market. You know, I know there are a lot there. I've read more than one tweet. What would it take to get Shesterkin? What would it take to get Sorokin? I don't think the Oilers have that capacity of assets. And they don't have the room for the money, which is the other part of this conversation that I think really is the driving force as to why they're going to cheap out on goalie again. And we typically see that. Teams either spend on a goalie or they have a young one. You know, more than half of the starters in the league last year, the majority of starts, I should say, of starters, were by guys drafted by that team. Because goalie, when you can keep the cost down, that's a market inefficiency. As soon as you start paying for a goalie, that's where the volatility that's baked into the position starts to become a problem. And I can attest to this. I watched Islander fans and Ranger fans tear apart Sorokin and Shesterkin last year for their inability to elevate themselves above the mess that was in front of them. And I don't think that's a fair ask because you can only do so much as a goalie. When you are in a score-dependent sport like hockey, where based on how much your team is losing or winning by is really going to dictate the style of play of the game, it's going to put you in multipliers effectively, like in a video game where because you're losing 2-0, you're going to be pushing even harder offensively to try and score, and you're going to ask your goalie to do even more than they already do behind a bad defensive team while your team is cheating for more offense. So it creates a negative feedback cycle where they constantly intersect with each other and spin back and forth, and it creates a crazy, crazy feeling. Because make no mistake, Shesterkin, Sorokin, I know UC Saros didn't have a great year last year either. Those guys are all really good goalies, and even only they can do so much in spite of what happens around them. And look, I know there's, I won't say a plurality even. There's a few loud voices screaming, what about Thatcher Demko? I don't think the Canucks are trading him in the division. I don't trust Thatcher Demko to stay healthy. He has just constantly been perpetually injured for almost his entire NHL tenure, which isn't even that long. And maybe that's why the Canucks would be more inclined to move him because he's so injury prone. I think if you're the Oilers and you really have your heart set on upgrading this goalie room, you need to find your restricted free agent or your team-controlled dart throw. Whether that's Jacob Dobyshev of Montreal, whether that's I don't even know, man. If you want to roll the dice on an Ilya Samsonov, if you want to roll the dice on somebody in that tier of guy who occasionally has been effective, you know, Vanacek, Georgiev, none of these guys inspire anything in the way of confidence, I think your best bet is looking at maybe an Arthur Shelovs of Vancouver, the backup. Maybe, like I said, Jacob Dovashev, or maybe you want to look at something like a Daniel Vladar. I think the Oilers need to bring in a third goalie. Now, the caliber of that goalie is ultimately going to be the question. Are they going to look for a real starter? And I don't think there's a starter they could get with the money making sense right now, so that's probably out. I do think they can get a goalie in here that is better than Calvin Pickard and make this more of a conventional A-B split as far as Skinner and whoever they bring in. I think Alex Lyon is a reasonable candidate. I mentioned a few of those backup goalies like Shelovs, Dobashev, or Daniel Vladar. I don't see the Oilers going after Jake Allen because I don't think they're going to have the money. And that's really the conundrum here if you're the Oilers. You have glaring holes in your roster right now. You probably need 2 top 6 wingers. You probably need at least one more defenseman to feel good about this. And then you need to add a goalie. You have no cap space to speak of. You cannot move Darnell Nurse because of his trade protections. You don't want to move Nugent-Hopkins or Hyman because those are important, impactful players for you who are at reasonably cost-efficient numbers. And then most of your depth, your Janmarks, your Adam Henriques, those guys don't really have a ton of value. You're not going to get anything in return for them. And sure, you could trade them and free up like the 1.5 for Janmark, the 3.5, 4 for Henrique. Are you going to get a player as good as them with that money? And it's such a difficult line to walk. And it's why I understand. And look, understanding and agreeing are not the same thing. I understand why Stan Bowman didn't go out and trade for John Gibson at the deadline last year, why he didn't trade for him now. He knows that if he did that, he was going to have to make a very barren bottom 6 on a team that he fancies is still a Stanley Cup contender. And if you have one of those bare bones bottom 6s like Tampa Bay, like Vegas, like the Rangers, and you go down the list, Toronto, Ottawa, it becomes really challenging to be competitive when you're icing guys for half the game, where your best case scenario is they're not losing that badly. And not even in terms of score, just in terms of game control. So unfortunately, I do think I might have been right about the Oilers and running back Skinner and Pickard. But that will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. I want to thank everyone that made Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Be sure to leave a review if you happen to be listening on Apple or Spotify. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. We're pushing for 2,500 subscribers, which is crazy because when I took over this channel, it was at 800 something. So we got to be doing something right. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Oh, real quick, be sure to check out Locked On NHL, wherever you get your podcasts. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.